Welcome to our latest explainer. Today, we're tackling a seriously fascinating, data-driven puzzle. What actually happens to a representative democracy when millions of fully eligible voters simply decide to stay home? This is part one of our journey into the election blues, and we're zeroing in on citizens who are registered, but right now completely unrepresented. Think about this for a second. What does democracy actually mean when roughly 3 out of 4 eligible registered voters do not participate? It feels like a massive contradiction, right? Campaigns are out there spending millions of dollars to identify and persuade voters. We fiercely debate ballot access, and yet, when Election Day finally rolls around, millions of people with the legal right to vote just don't. But the election doesn't stop. The people who do show up are making the decisions for absolutely everyone else. So how representative is our government really under these conditions? Okay, let's dive into this. 25.26%. That is the turnout rate from Florida's August 2026 primary, based on the very first set of unofficial returns reported on August 21st. To put that number into perspective, out of over 13.4 million eligible active registered voters, only about 3.39 million ballots were actually cast. That leaves approximately 10 million eligible registered voters who did not cast a ballot. 10 million. Now, keeping in mind that while 100% of precincts were reporting for this metric, these results do remain unofficial until certification, but wow, the sheer volume of missing voters is just impossible to ignore. Now, when you see 10 million missing voters, your immediate reaction might be to just write them off as lazy or apathetic. But as data detectives, we can't jump to conclusions that fast. We need to look at historical gaps. This is our first major clue in this mystery. We need to compare how these exact same voters behave when it's an August primary versus a November general election. Because when you look at the data, there's a massive, recurring whiplash between these elections. Take 2018, for example. Florida moved from a 27.5% primary turnout to 62.6% in the general election. That's a 35-point jump. In 2022, the gap was nearly 28 points. And in the 2024 presidential year, turnout skyrocketed from 22.4% in the primary all the way up to 78.9% in November. If you look at individual counties, places like Miami-Dade and Palm Beach will leap from around 20% in a primary to well over 70 or 80% in the general. This proves unequivocally that Floridians totally have the civic capacity to vote. They are highly capable of showing up when they feel it really matters. And that brings us to the core takeaway from this historical data, which is perfectly summarized by this quote from our source material. Florida proves people will vote. The harder question is why they believe some elections matter and others do not. It's a really profound thought, isn't it? Is it about the race being highly competitive? Is it a lack of information? Why does the perceived consequence of an election shift so dramatically in the minds of the electorate between August and November? Well, to answer that, we've got to look beyond voter psychology. We need to look at the structural rules of voting, basically the plumbing of the system. Before we just place all the blame squarely on the voter, we have to neutrally examine how the election design itself might be creating friction, because the rules fundamentally alter the math of who is even allowed to participate. And this brilliantly illustrates what I mean. As of July 2026, Florida had 5.6 million active registered Republicans and over 4 million Democrats. But look at this. Nearly 3.33 million Florida voters are registered with no party affiliation. That's nearly 1 in 4 active registered voters in the state actively rejecting formal major party labels. This is incredibly important because Florida is a closed primary state. So in partisan primaries, voters generally can only vote for candidates of the party they're registered with. Now, actually, to be totally fair, those 3.33 million no-party affiliation voters aren't completely excluded from everything. They can still participate in nonpartisan races or universal primary contests, but they generally cannot help select a Republican or Democratic nominee. This rule inherently shrinks the pool, the denominator, of who can vote in the major contests. It opens up a totally valid policy question. If a growing share of citizens is ditching party labels, should the major parties remain the exclusive gateways to the November ballot? So is this just how it is? Is low primary turnout just an inevitable feature of American democracy? Let's zoom out to a control group and see how other states handle their primary election designs, because as you'll see, these systems are far from uniform across the country. Let's compare two totally different approaches. In Colorado, unaffiliated voters are legally permitted to participate in major party primaries, and nearly 98% of their ballots are cast by mail. Their certified 2026 primary turnout hit 35.86%, with unaffiliated voters casting over 40% of those ballots. On the flip side, we have Minnesota. Minnesota offers incredibly easy access. Voters don't even declare a party when registering, and they can register right on Election Day. Yet their unofficial 2026 primary turnout was still lingering right around 25%. Now, we aren't saying one specific role magically dictates a specific turnout rate. What this really proves is that while closed primaries aren't unavoidable, there's no single silver bullet reform that automatically fixes participation. Okay, let's shift gears and talk about the actual mathematics of voting for a second. Because when you read the news, election statistics can sound completely contradictory. And honestly, that's usually because they're measuring completely different populations.
Walk through this with me in what we can call the funnel of democracy. First, you have the total eligible population, adults legally allowed to vote. Step 2 is active registration, those who actually did the paperwork to sign up. Step 3 is ballot-eligible voters, which, as we just saw with Florida's closed primaries, can be a much smaller group. And finally, you have ballots cast, which gives you turnout. If you swap around the denominators, you get wildly different stats. It's kind of like asking how many people are at a party versus how many people are actually dancing. Both numbers are correct, they're just answering different questions. For instance, Florida officially reported a 78.9% turnout in the 2024 general election based on registered voters. But the University of Florida Election Lab estimates it was actually 67.4% based on the voting eligible population.
So the crucial point is understanding the fundamental difference between a registration record and a cast ballot. Voter roll accuracy is an integrity question. States routinely remove ineligible people because someone moved or passed away, and that's governed by federal laws. But a stale registration record is literally just a data quality issue. It alone absolutely does not prove that an illegal vote occurred. An illegal vote requires actual evidence of a cast ballot. A trustworthy system has to maintain accurate lists, sure, but it also has to protect eligible voters from being improperly kicked off. All right, so now that we've mapped out the math, we have to ask the most consequential question of this entire explainer. When turnout is remarkably low, when that denominator shrinks, who actually holds the reins? Low turnout doesn't just create a smaller electorate, it creates a completely different electorate. Take the 2022 midterms, for example. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, people aged 65 and older made up 23.8% of the citizen voting age population, but they accounted for a massive 30.4% of actual voters. Meanwhile, young adults aged 18 to 29 made up nearly 20% of the population, but cast only 11.7% of the ballots. In that election, an estimated 37.2 million registered voters simply didn't vote, and the demographics of who decided to stay home completely shifted the balance of power. We see a very similar, striking divide when we look at education. In the 2024 presidential election, census data shows turnout was 82.5% among citizens with advanced degrees and 77.2% for bachelor's degree holders. But for high school graduates, turnout was only 52.5%. Listen, politicians are smart. Campaigns intensely study these historical turnout patterns, and this creates a rational but very uncomfortable incentive. Groups that consistently vote are heavily catered to, while politicians have far, far less incentive to listen to groups that repeatedly stay home. Which brings us to a really deep philosophical crossroads. America rightfully treats voting as a fundamental right. But is it only a right, or does it also carry a civic responsibility? Think about jury duty, paying your taxes, obeying civic rules. Some countries, like Australia, actually have compulsory voting and see turnout well over 90%. Now, we aren't saying the U.S. should copy compulsory voting. That raises huge legal and philosophical questions here. But it does force us to ask, should citizenship carry some baseline expectation of participating in choosing the people who make decisions for everyone else? But hey, before the government can start pointing fingers and fairly lecturing the voter about civic duty, the government has its own homework to do. Participation has to be accessible and trustworthy. That means publishing clear, timely information about what each office actually does. It means maintaining accurate rolls without improperly removing legal voters. It means simplifying the rules for registration and mail-in voting, and actually providing meaningful accommodations for voters who are balancing work, caregiving, or navigating disabilities. If you take away absolutely nothing else from our explainer today, let it be this powerful summary from our source material. Registration is infrastructure. Participation is democracy. Registering voters is absolutely essential, but it's just the plumbing. If the water doesn't flow through the pipes, if the people don't actually cast their ballots, we simply aren't fully realizing the promise of our system. And that leaves us right on the edge of a very steep cliff. Because when millions of citizens remove themselves from the decision-making process, political power doesn't just vanish into thin air. It concentrates. It gathers right into the hands of the highly engaged few who actually do show up. So the ultimate question is, who benefits when most of us stay home? Who is gaining a larger share of influence? We're going to answer exactly that in part 2 of the Election Blues. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll see you next time.